I found the receipt for a hotel room in my husband's coat pocket on a bright Tuesday morning, the kind of ordinary morning where sunlight pours through kitchen curtains and coffee steams in a favorite mug, and in the space of reading 11 printed words, my entire life folded in half like a piece of paper meant to be thrown away. Before I tell you what happened next, before I tell you about the stranger who walked into my daughter's life and mine and changed everything we thought we knew about love and trust, I want to ask you something. If you believe in kindness, if you believe people can be broken and still find their way back to wholeness, if you believe in forgiveness and second chances and the quiet, stubborn hope that keeps ordinary people going through their darkest mornings, please take a moment right now to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who might need it today, and subscribe to our channel. Our community here is built on stories like this one, real and raw and human, and every single one of you who joins us makes this space a little warmer. Now let me tell you about the spring my world ended and somehow, impossibly, began again. My name is Claire Whitfield, and at the time all of this happened, I was 34 years old, living in a modest brick house on Larkspur Lane in a small Ohio town called Millbrook, the kind of town where everyone recognizes your car and the bakery on Main Street still uses a bell above the door. I had been married to my husband, Grant, for 9 years. We had a daughter named Poppy, 7 years old, with a gap-toothed smile and an obsession with drawing horses in the margins of every piece of paper she could find. I taught 3rd grade at Millbrook Elementary, the same school Poppy attended, and Grant worked as a regional sales manager for a company that made industrial flooring, which meant he traveled 2, sometimes 3 nights a week. I had never once questioned those trips. I packed his suitcase sometimes, folded his shirts, tucked in his phone charger, kissed him goodbye at the door with Poppy hanging off my hip. I trusted him the way you trust gravity, without thinking about it, without needing proof, simply because it had never once given me reason to doubt. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Poppy was arguing with her cereal, insisting the milk made it too soggy too fast, and I was ironing one of Grant's shirts for an out-of-town conference he said he had that weekend. I reached into his coat pocket looking for a stray receipt to toss, the way I always did before laundry day, a habit worn smooth over years of marriage. Instead of a gas station receipt or a lunch tab, I found a folded slip from a hotel 2 towns over, dated for a weekend Grant had told me he'd be in Columbus for work. The charge included a late checkout fee and a note about a bottle of champagne sent to the room. I remember standing there in my kitchen, iron still hissing steam onto cotton, Poppy's spoon clinking against her bowl in the next room, and feeling the strangest sensation, as if the floor had not moved at all but I had somehow fallen through it anyway. I did not confront him immediately. I want to be honest with you, because this story only means something if I am honest. I spent 3 days pretending everything was normal, smiling at dinner, laughing at Poppy's jokes, lying beside Grant at night with my back to him, staring at the wall, running through every excuse he might have, praying that I was wrong, that there was some innocent explanation involving a coworker or a mix-up or a hotel error. But on the 3rd night, I found a text on an old tablet we shared for family photos, a message from a woman named Renata that made every excuse collapse. Grant had not just cheated once. He had been seeing her for nearly 8 months, meeting her in the towns he visited for work, telling her things about our marriage that were both true and cruelly twisted, complaining about a wife who had let herself go, and a daughter who was always the priority instead of him. Reading those words about myself and about Poppy, our sweet, horse-drawing, gap-toothed Poppy, did something to me that the discovery of the affair alone had not. It turned my grief into something harder, something with edges. I confronted him on a Saturday afternoon, because I refused to let this conversation happen at night, in shadows, where things could be softened or hidden. I wanted daylight. I wanted to see his face clearly when he answered me. Poppy was at her friend Daisy's birthday party, and I had exactly 2 hours of empty house to have this conversation, so I did not waste time on preamble. I set the tablet on the kitchen table, the messages still open, and asked him to explain it to me. Grant did not deny it. To this day, I think some small part of me respects that he didn't lie further, though it does not undo the months of lies that came before. He said things people say in these moments, that it had gotten out of hand, that he never meant to hurt me, that Renata meant nothing, though the words on the screen suggested otherwise. I asked him to leave that same day, and to his credit, he did not fight me on it, perhaps because he understood, somewhere beneath the shame, that fighting would have been its own kind of insult. I did not cry in front of him. I want you to understand that this was not because I was strong in some cinematic, unshakable way, but because I had a daughter due home from a birthday party in 90 minutes, and I refused to let her walk into a house that smelled like her mother's devastation. I cried later, in the shower, where the water could carry away the sound, and then I dried my face, put on a clean shirt, and drove to pick up Poppy, smiling at her the way I had smiled 1,000 times before, asking about the cake and the games and whether Daisy had liked her present. Children have a way of anchoring us to the ordinary even when the extraordinary has just shattered everything, and in that first week, Poppy's small routines, her questions about spelling homework, her insistence on a particular blue cup for her milk, these were the only things that kept me moving forward at all. Within a month, I had moved out of the house on Larkspur Lane. It had been Grant's before we married, technically in his name, and though a lawyer told me I had rights to fight for it, I did not have the stomach for a prolonged battle over walls and floors when every one of those walls now held a memory I wanted to escape. My sister, Wren, who lived 3 hours away in a lakeside town called Aldergate, told me to come stay with her, at least for a little while, at least until I figured out what came next. Wren had always been the practical one, the one who kept lists and made plans, while I had been the dreamer, the one who believed love simply worked out if you were kind enough and patient enough. That belief had cost me 9 years and left me, at 34, packing a rented U-Haul with a 7-year-old's bicycle and boxes of children's books, starting over in a town I barely knew. The drive to Aldergate took place on a bright, almost obnoxiously beautiful morning, the sky a hard, cloudless blue, sunlight glinting off the hood of the U-Haul like the world hadn't gotten the memo that my life had fallen apart. Poppy sat beside me with her seatbelt pulled snug, humming along to a children's playlist, occasionally asking why we were moving, and I gave her the gentlest version of the truth I could manage, that sometimes grown-ups make mistakes that mean a family has to live in 2 houses instead of 1, that this did not mean anyone loved her any less. She accepted this with the strange, matter-of-fact resilience that children often have, more resilience, honestly, than I could locate in myself most days. I remember gripping the steering wheel and thinking that I had no plan beyond arriving at my sister's house, no job lined up in Aldergate, no idea how I would rebuild an identity that had been Grant's wife and Poppy's mother for so long that I had nearly forgotten what it meant to simply be Claire. Aldergate turned out to be a town built around a lake so clear you could see the smooth stones on its bottom from the pier, with a main street of converted Victorian houses turned into shops, a diner called the Copper Spoon, and an elementary school within walking distance of Wren's house. Wren welcomed us with the kind of chaotic, overflowing love that only a sister can offer, immediately putting Poppy to work helping her water tomato plants in the backyard garden, immediately putting a glass of iced tea in my hand and telling me to sit down before I even set down my bags. For the first 2 weeks, I did little more than exist. I helped Poppy get enrolled in her new school, filled out forms with hands that still trembled some days, walked along the lake in the mornings while Wren watched Poppy, and tried to remember how to breathe without the weight of betrayal sitting on my chest. It was on one of these lakeside mornings, nearly 3 weeks after we'd arrived in Aldergate, that I met the man who would become, in ways I could never have predicted, the reason our lives changed course entirely. I want to be clear that this is not a simple story about a woman finding a new romance to replace an old one. If you're expecting that, I'd ask you to keep listening, because what happened was both smaller and far larger than a love story. His name was Desmond Okafor Whitcomb, though everyone in Aldergate simply called him Des, a man in his early 60s who ran a small boat repair shop down by the marina and who I first noticed because he was sitting on a bench near the pier every single morning at exactly 7, feeding stale bread to a group of ducks with the patient, unhurried air of a man who had nowhere else he needed to be. The first time we actually spoke, Poppy was the one who started it, not me. She had wandered ahead of me on the path, as 7-year-olds do, chasing a duck that had waddled too close to the water's edge, and she'd slipped on a patch of wet grass, scraping her palm against the gravel. She wasn't hurt badly, more startled than anything, but she burst into the kind of loud, dramatic tears that only a scared child can produce, and before I could even reach her, Des was crouched down at her level, offering her a clean handkerchief from his jacket pocket and telling her, in a calm, gravelly voice, that ducks were notorious troublemakers and that he'd once seen one steal a man's sandwich right off a picnic table. Poppy stopped crying almost instantly, more interested in the sandwich story than her scraped palm, and by the time I reached them, she was already asking Des if the duck had gotten in trouble for stealing. I thanked him profusely, embarrassed and grateful in equal measure, and he waved it off with the easy humility of someone unaccustomed to being thanked for small kindnesses, saying only that he was glad to help and that the ducks really were troublemakers. Ask anyone at the marina. There was something in his manner that put me instantly at ease, a kind of steadiness that I had not felt in months, not since before I'd found that hotel receipt in Grant's coat pocket. We talked for a few minutes longer, about nothing important, about the weather and the ducks and how Poppy's scraped palm would probably not even need a bandage, and then we went our separate ways, and I did not think much more of it beyond a small, warm memory of an unexpectedly kind stranger. But Aldergate, as it turned out, was small enough that our paths crossed again and again over the following weeks. Des was at the pier most mornings, and I began walking there deliberately, though I told myself it was only for the fresh air, only because Poppy liked feeding the ducks with him. We would talk, briefly at first, and then longer, about small things, the way you do when you are testing whether a stranger is safe to know. I learned that Des had lived in Aldergate his whole life, that he had lost his wife, Marguerite, to cancer nearly 11 years earlier, and that he had no children of his own, something he mentioned once with a quiet, matter-of-fact sadness that told me it was a wound he had made peace with but never fully closed. He ran his boat shop mostly alone these days, though he mentioned an old friend named Harold who helped him on busier weekends, and he seemed, in a way I didn't fully understand yet, to be a man who had built an entire life around small routines and small kindnesses because the big things, the wife, the family, the future he'd once imagined, had been taken from him early. I did not tell him about Grant for a long time, not because I was ashamed exactly, but because I had grown so used to holding my pain privately, tucking it away the way you tuck away a receipt you don't want anyone to see. It was Poppy, again, who cracked open the conversation, this time by asking Des, with the blunt honesty only children possess, why he didn't have a wife to bring to the pier with him. I felt my stomach drop, embarrassed on Des's behalf, but he answered her gently, telling her that his wife had gotten very sick and had gone to a place where sickness couldn't reach her anymore, and that he missed her every single day, but that missing someone didn't mean you stopped living your life, it just meant you carried them with you while you did it. Poppy considered this with the serious concentration she gave to all new ideas, and then she said, matter-of-factly, that her daddy didn't live with them anymore either, because he had made a mistake, and that her mommy cried sometimes when she thought Poppy was asleep. I remember the flush of heat that rushed through my face, the urge to correct her, to smooth it over, but Des simply nodded, as if this was a perfectly reasonable thing for a 7-year-old to share, and said only that mistakes were a heavy thing to carry, for the person who made them and for the people who loved them, and that he was sorry her family was going through something so hard. That evening, walking back to Wren's house with Poppy's small hand in mine, I found myself crying, not out of sadness exactly, but out of something closer to relief, the relief of being seen without having to perform strength I didn't feel. Over the following weeks, Des and I settled into an easy, unspoken friendship, one built on early mornings and duck bread and the kind of conversations that unspool slowly, revealing themselves in layers. I told him, eventually, about the hotel receipt, about Renata's texts, about the strange numbness that had followed me from Millbrook to Aldergate like a shadow I couldn't shake. He listened without offering easy answers, without telling me that everything happened for a reason or that I would find someone better someday, platitudes I had already heard too many times from well-meaning friends. Instead, he told me about the year after Marguerite died, when he had barely left his house, when the boat shop had nearly gone under because he could not bring himself to answer the phone, and how it had been small things, ridiculous things, a neighbor's dog that kept wandering into his yard, a leaking faucet he was forced to fix, that had slowly, stubbornly pulled him back into the business of living. It was Des who first suggested that I might find work at the marina office, a part-time position handling bookings and paperwork for boat rentals during the summer season, when he overheard me telling Ren that I needed something, anything, to occupy the hours while Poppy was at school and to start rebuilding some financial independence from Grant, who had been slow and grudging about support payments. I was hesitant at first, unsure whether I had any skills that would translate to marina work, but Des simply said that showing up reliably and treating people decently covered most of what the job required, and that the rest could be learned. I took the position, nervous and unsure, in early June, and found, much to my surprise, that the work suited me. There was something soothing about the rhythm of the marina, boats coming and going, families loading up coolers and life jackets, the lake stretching out flat and silver in the morning light. I began to feel, for the first time in months, like a person with a shape of her own, rather than simply the wreckage left behind after someone else's betrayal. The turning point, the moment that this story is really about, happened in late July, on an afternoon so bright and ordinary that nothing about it suggested anything significant was about to unfold. Poppy had taken to spending her afternoons at the boat shop with Des after school let out for summer, sitting on an overturned bucket and sanding small scraps of wood he gave her to keep her hands busy, chattering to him about horses and her new friends and whatever book she was reading. On this particular afternoon, I arrived at the shop to pick her up and found Des sitting very still at his workbench, an open envelope in his hands, his face pale in a way I had never seen on him before. Poppy was uncharacteristically quiet beside him, sensing, the way children do, that something serious had happened even if she couldn't name it. Des told me, once Poppy had wandered off to look at the ducks near the shop's back door, that the letter was from a lawyer representing a woman named Coraline Ashworth, a name he hadn't heard in over 30 years. Coraline, it turned out, had been a young woman Des had loved deeply in his 20s, before Marguerite, a relationship that had ended abruptly and painfully when Coraline's family moved away and the two lost touch in the years before easy phone calls and internet searches made losing touch nearly impossible. The letter explained that Coraline had passed away recently, and that in going through her affairs, her family had discovered she'd given birth to a son shortly after she and Des had parted ways, a son she had raised alone, a son who was now a 58-year-old man named Thomas who had only just learned, from his mother's private papers, that the man he'd always believed to be his father was not his biological one, and that his actual father might be a boat repairman living in a small lake town called Aldergate. I sat with Des for nearly 2 hours that afternoon while he processed the impossible weight of this news, the discovery that he had a son he'd never known existed, a son now on the cusp of retirement age himself, a son who might reach out or might never want to know him at all. Des kept saying, over and over, that he didn't know what to do with his hands, an odd thing to fixate on, but I understood it as his way of saying that his entire sense of what his life had been, a life of loss and quiet routine, had suddenly cracked open to reveal a different shape entirely, one that included a family he hadn't known he had. I remember thinking, watching him turn that letter over and over in his weathered hands, how strange it was that grief and hope could arrive in the very same envelope, indistinguishable from each other until you had the courage to open it. Over the following weeks, I found myself, almost without noticing how it happened, becoming Des's steadiest support as he navigated the surreal process of reaching out to a son he'd never known. I helped him draft the first letter to Thomas, sitting at his kitchen table with cups of tea going cold between us, revising sentences again and again because Des was terrified of saying the wrong thing, of scaring away a connection before it had even begun. I remember telling him what I had learned, painfully, from my own experience with Grant, that the truth, however frightening, was always a better foundation than a carefully managed version of events, and that Thomas deserved to know the honest shape of what had happened between Des and Coraline all those years ago, not a polished story designed to make Des look better. Des took this advice seriously, and the letter he eventually sent was raw and unguarded, describing his memories of Coraline with tenderness, admitting his own regrets about how their relationship had ended, and expressing, without demanding anything in return, his hope that Thomas might want to know him. Thomas wrote back 3 weeks later, and I was there in the boat shop the afternoon the letter arrived, watching Des's hands shake as he opened it, watching Poppy sit unusually still on her bucket, sensing the gravity of the moment even at 7 years old. Thomas's letter was cautious but warm, explaining that he had been angry at first, angry at a mother who had kept such an enormous secret his entire life, but that reading about Coraline's memories of Des, memories she had apparently written about in private journals, had softened something in him. He said he was not ready to call Des his father, not yet, but that he would be willing to meet, to see where things might go from there, if Des was open to that. Des read this letter aloud to me and Poppy in a voice that kept catching, and when he finished, he simply sat there for a long moment before saying that he never imagined, at 62 years old, that his life still had this much room left to grow. The meeting between Des and Thomas took place in early September, at a small restaurant in Aldergate that overlooked the lake, and Des asked me, somewhat shyly, if Poppy and I would be nearby, not necessarily at the table, but close enough that he could find us afterward if he needed to talk. I understood, without him fully explaining it, that he needed the steadiness of familiar faces on a day that would otherwise feel entirely unmoored. Poppy and I sat at the diner across the street, the Copper Spoon, sharing a plate of pancakes and watching through the window as Des paced nervously outside the restaurant before a tall, silver-haired man arrived, a man who, even from a distance, had the unmistakable set of Des's shoulders and the same careful way of standing that Des had. I watched them shake hands, then embrace, briefly and awkwardly, the embrace of two men who did not yet know each other but who recognized, on some cellular level, that they belonged to the same story. Des and Thomas talked for nearly 3 hours that afternoon, and when Des finally crossed the street to find us at the diner, his eyes were red-rimmed but his whole face had changed, loosened somehow, the way a fist loosens after being clenched for a very long time. He told me that Thomas had brought photographs of Coraline from over the years, photographs of a woman who had built a good life, who had married eventually, who had raised Thomas with love even while carrying the secret of his true parentage, and that seeing her face again after 30 years had felt like being handed back a piece of himself he had thought was lost forever. He told me that Thomas had a wife named Dahlia and 2 grown children of his own, meaning that Des, in the space of a single letter, had gained not just a son but grandchildren, an entire branch of family he had never known was growing somewhere else in the world, waiting, in its own strange way, to be found. I want to pause here and ask you, if this story has moved you at all so far, to please take a moment to leave a comment sharing what this story means to you. Perhaps a moment in your own life when an unexpected person or unexpected news changed everything you thought you knew about your future. Your comments mean more than you know, both to me and to everyone else who finds comfort in these stories of ordinary people surviving extraordinary heartbreak, and I read every single one. What happened over the following months was not a fairy tale in the way that phrase usually implies, no sudden reversal of fortune, no dramatic reconciliation with Grant, no swelling music as the credits rolled. It was slower than that, and in some ways harder, and in other ways far more satisfying. Des began spending holidays with Thomas's family, driving the 4 hours to their home in a town called Cresthaven, bringing back photographs of grandchildren he was slowly learning to love, a granddaughter named Ivy who shared his habit of humming while she worked and a grandson named Cassius who had inherited, of all things, Des's exact laugh. Watching Des rebuild an entire family structure from a single unexpected letter taught me something I hadn't fully understood before, that the family we are given and the family we build are not always the same thing, and that it is never too late, not at 34 and not at 62, to discover that your life holds more rooms than you thought it did. Meanwhile, my own life in Aldergate was quietly, steadily rebuilding itself. Poppy thrived at her new school, made a close friend named Genevieve who lived 2 streets over, and slowly stopped asking, every few weeks, when we would go back to the house on Larkspur Lane, because Wren's house, and increasingly a small rental cottage 2 blocks from the marina that I signed a lease on that autumn, had become simply home. Grant and I finalized our divorce in October, a process that was painful but mercifully quick, since he did not contest custody or the modest support arrangement, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of his own desire to move on with Renata, who I later heard he had in fact continued seeing, though I found I could think of this news with something closer to distant pity than the searing jealousy I might have expected. Poppy visited her father 1 weekend a month, an arrangement that worked reasonably well, and though I will not pretend the wound of his betrayal healed completely, I found that it had, by winter, scarred over into something I could live around rather than something that consumed every hour of every day. My friendship with Des deepened into something I can only describe as a chosen family bond, not romantic, though I know some listeners might expect that turn, but something perhaps rarer and in some ways more valuable, a friendship between two people who had each lost the life they expected and found, in each other's company, the courage to build a different one. Des became, in every way that mattered, a grandfather figure to Poppy, attending her school recitals, teaching her to sand and varnish small wooden boats in his shop, showing up at her 7th, then 8th birthday party with presents that always involved some small handmade object he had crafted himself. And I became, in turn, someone Des could lean on through the complicated, joyful, sometimes overwhelming process of integrating a found family into a life he had long ago resigned himself to living alone. By the following spring, nearly a full year after that terrible Tuesday morning when I found a hotel receipt in Grant's coat pocket, I stood on the pier in Aldergate on another bright morning, watching Poppy toss stale bread to a new generation of ducks, and I found myself thinking not of Grant, not of Renata, not of the house on Larkspur Lane, but of how strange and generous life could be, offering devastation and grace in such close proximity that you could barely tell where one ended and the other began. I had lost a marriage, yes, and the particular future I had once imagined for myself and my daughter. But I had gained a town by a lake, a job that made me feel capable again, a sister who had opened her home without hesitation, and a friendship with a kind, weathered stranger who had taught my daughter that ducks were troublemakers and taught me, without ever intending to, that second chances did not always look like romance or redemption in the way we expect, but sometimes looked like an unexpected letter, an unexpected son, an unexpected family, arriving exactly when you had stopped believing anything unexpected and good could happen to you at all. Des passed away 3 years later, peacefully, in his sleep, at the age of 65, and Thomas called me himself to share the news, because by then our families had become so thoroughly woven together that such a call felt natural rather than strange. At the funeral, held on another bright, cloudless afternoon by the lake he loved, Poppy, then 11 years old, stood up during the service, uninvited but unstoppable in the way that children sometimes are, and told the gathered mourners about the day Des had rescued her from a duck-related crisis and a scraped palm, and how he had told her that mistakes were heavy things to carry but that carrying them didn't mean you stopped living your life. Thomas cried through the whole story, and so did I, and so, I noticed, did half the marina staff who had come to pay their respects to a man who had spent his final years discovering, against every expectation, that his family had never actually finished growing. I think about that Tuesday morning often, the iron hissing steam, Poppy arguing with her cereal, the hotel receipt folded in my hand like a small, terrible key. I could not have known, standing in that kitchen with my entire understanding of my life collapsing around me, that the collapse would eventually lead me to a lake town, a boat shop, a duck-feeding stranger, and a lesson about family and forgiveness that I would carry with me for the rest of my days. I do not say this to suggest that betrayal is somehow worth it if good things follow, because I do not believe pain needs to be justified by its aftermath in order to be survived. I say it only because I think many of us, in our darkest mornings, cannot imagine that anything good waits on the other side of the wreckage, and I wanted you to know, if you are standing in your own version of that kitchen right now, iron hissing, world collapsing, that sometimes it does. Sometimes a stranger on a park bench, feeding stale bread to troublemaking ducks, is waiting to remind you what kindness looks like, right when you have most forgotten. Before we close this story together, I want to ask you something important, something I hope you'll sit with for a moment. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of your own capacity for resilience or reminded you of someone in your life who arrived exactly when you needed them, please leave a comment below sharing the lesson this story taught you, whether it's about forgiveness, about the family we choose, about second chances that arrive in forms we never expect, or simply about the quiet, stubborn hope that carries ordinary people through their hardest days. Your words help build our community into a place where people come not just to watch a story, but to feel less alone in their own. And if this story touched your heart even a little, please like this video, leave that meaningful comment, share it with someone who might need a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey like this one. Our family here, all of you who return week after week to sit with these stories, has become its own kind of unexpected grace in my life, and I am endlessly grateful for it. Claire Whitfield still lives in that small cottage near the marina in Aldergate, though Poppy is nearly grown now, tall and steady and still, to this day, better with a sanding block than most adults twice her age. The ducks are still troublemakers. The lake still turns silver in the early morning light. And somewhere in the quiet architecture of an ordinary life rebuilt from wreckage, there remains the enduring, unshakable truth that even when someone we love breaks our heart beyond what we think we can survive, the world still holds room for kindness to walk up and sit down beside us, sometimes in the shape of a stranger, sometimes in the shape of a letter we never expected to receive, and sometimes simply in the shape of a bright, ordinary morning that insists, against all odds, on beginning again.